This is episode 5 of my podcast, The Neverending Experiment. Thank you for tuning in. I'm still getting used to this podcasting process and learning a lot about the technology. Hopefully this sound is a bit better than it was when I first started, getting all of that sorted out. Today I'm going to talk about genealogy and something that I have a huge interest in. I've been down that rabbit hole for around 10 years. That's when I really got started on it. I've always been interested in history and ancestry, and I've always felt strongly in connecting to my roots, which are almost completely in Europe. But genealogy is a light into seeing who you are and how you are connected to the past. Some people just seem to be really naturally drawn to genealogy and knowing their family trees. Other people don't care as much. It's just one of those things. Some people feel that longing to be connected to the past. I did do 23andMe. After that, I also did Ancestry DNA. Now, both of those companies will give you access to raw data that you can then upload to other companies. So either of those is a good one to start off with if you are interested in going down that road and learning more about your DNA. So the thing about these DNA tests, a lot of them kind of sell them as like fact that you're going to find out all these facts about yourself from your DNA. But a lot of the research is pretty soft. So they may connect you with a certain trait or a certain ethnicity based on their database, but it's not always 100% true. And the reason it's not is because genetics is so complicated. So one gene doesn't necessarily belong to one people. It doesn't necessarily have to do with one trait either. The whole thing you have to take with a grain of salt. But that doesn't mean that it's not really informative. And the reason I like being a part of it is because it is research. So the goal is to learn more into the future. So it's not just about that they're giving you the results of all this science. You are becoming part of the science when you join one of those companies. I also uploaded my raw data, as I mentioned, that you can access that from those companies. And I uploaded it onto other DNA companies. So I am now on 7 different DNA companies. And they have given me a lot of information on my ancestry. And of course, that is really what I want to talk about, is the ancestry part of that. When we measure ethnicities, we generally use geographical areas. And as we all know, people can move. We move a lot. Many people have immigrated in their life, or they are descended from immigrants. So because of immigration, of course, we can't know if anyone is truly from a place. And that brings up issues of who is indigenous to where. And depending on how you measure it, you may use categories of ethnicities that are common today, or you may use categories of ethnicities that were common in the past. So most of us will measure our ethnicity now based on pre-Columbian geography, so before Columbus came to the Americas. So for me, obviously, I have European ancestry, even though my ancestors have been in North America since probably the early 1600s or maybe even late 1500s. We seem to have forgotten that European is an ethnicity at all, and we use the term white or Caucasian, which is completely wrong because Caucasian is based on the place, the Caucasus. So that's a real geographical area with real people that live there. And outwardly, we would say that they probably look Middle Eastern. They don't look European. They somehow changed the meaning of Caucasian to mean European. And I don't want to start any conspiracy theories about that. I just think it's very strange that we seem to understand pretty well now that Native Americans are not Indian. And we know that the term Indian actually should refer to people from India. And yet we haven't seemed to figure that out about Caucasians or Europeans. So it turns out I only have a trace of Caucasian in my ancestry, and I'm, other than that, over 99% European. And that's according to pretty much all of the DNA tests that I did. So I want to just go over some of those tests and talk a little bit about the different companies out there. Now, what I was told growing up and what I've discovered is that I have Quebec ancestry going back, from what I knew then, at least 13 generations. Turns out it's even longer. And mostly Scottish on my dad's side. And my mom was not only Quebecois, but also Franco-Saskatchewan. So her great-grandparents moved from France to Saskatchewan. And that was the story that we were told anyway. And I'm not 100% sure what happened there. And then my grandfather on my mom's side was born in London, England, and moved to Canada as a child. But there was one great-grandmother on my dad's side that we weren't totally sure what her background was. And it turns out she is, of all the places in the world, her ancestors are from Ontario, Canada. So not very far at all. It turns out she was descended from United Empire Loyalists, who were the fighters against the American revolutionaries in the Revolutionary War in the United States. So it turns out not only do I have ancestry in Quebec, I also have ancestry in Ontario. And according to Ancestry DNA, that is confirmed that actually they did find that genetically I am connected to the settler populations in both southern Ontario and southern Quebec. So that was confirmed. The other stories I heard was there was always a big maybe about perhaps having Native American ancestry. And the more that I look, the more that it's maybe, and I really don't have strong confirmation about it. Almost every DNA test has shown none. And given that the likelihood of when I may have had Native American ancestor, it would have been back in the early 1600s, most likely. And so I did find a couple people when I did my family tree in the genealogy on Ancestry DNA. And again, they were contested. There was a group of people saying, yes, this person was Native American, and another group of people saying, no, they weren't. So two different people that were contested, and it's hard to say. It ended up just feeling like a maybe again. Now I'd kind of given up on finding any Native American ancestry, and the very last test that I tried, which is on a website called My True Ancestry, which I'll come back to, and that showed a tiny little bit of Native American, under 0.1%, so really small amount, but it did show it. So that was pretty interesting, and I thought, okay, well, so we're back to maybe yes rather than maybe no, and I'm fine not knowing for sure. So it doesn't really bother me. I mean, it doesn't really change my identity. And I think the more that you learn, the more you just kind of learn to loosen up about your identity and not get too caught up in what it means. So as I mentioned, of course, because people move from place to place, most genes are not only found in one country. Most genes are found in multiple countries. If you look at a map of where genes are found, usually what you see is a concentrated circle in one area, and then a little bit outside of that circle, you see people with that gene in a little bit less of concentration, and then a circle outside of that a little bit less. And usually those circles relate to some sort of migration that happened. So in that highly concentrated inner circle is probably where the gene originated, and then you can see where the descendants of that person may have moved to and why it's found in different places. So it is really confusing. Most of the websites don't advertise how vague the real percentages are. And of course, we all have mutations. Everybody has at least a few mutations. I think the average for a normal person is around 60. So I want to go through the different tests because I have done a bunch of them. And so I actually have a spreadsheet with all of the numbers on it. And I just want to go over it to kind of do a bit of comparison. So the ones that I've done, first of all, I did my own genealogical research on Ancestry and I found out a whole lot. That's where I found out about my Ontario ancestry. So if I look at those numbers, what I'm getting is around 79.75. So basically almost 80% from the British Isles. That's my genealogical research. So that's just judging from my actual ancestors and where they're from. And I did that math myself. And I also came up with around 6% from Ireland, 37.5% from Scotland, 36% from England, and 25% from France. And then the other smaller numbers, so under 1% from Germany, Holland, and perhaps from Spain. That was something that I remember my grandmother saying vaguely. I also vaguely remember maybe that saying that we might be part gypsy. And I was never really sure about that. Those are just memories that I have from when I was quite young. I'm never able to confirm those. And of gypsy nowadays usually go by the name Roma or Romani. So, what did I find in comparison to that genealogical research? So, Ancestry DNA. Now, I have Ancestry DNA listed 3 times on my chart, and that's because they kept changing their numbers. So, remember, I had almost 80% in my original estimate, and on Ancestry DNA, they have 73%, and that was the first time that they put this together. And then it changed to 80%, so almost exactly what I found. And then it changed to 93%. So you can see how much that changed. Now, another website that I did is called My Living DNA. And that's a really interesting one, I think, especially if you're from the British Isles like myself, because what they do is break down the entire British Isles into regions. So you can actually find out what specific region your DNA is from. And what I found out in the 2 websites that offer that the number 1 place in the world where my DNA is from is London, England, which is where my grandpa was born. And so that confirms that. So My Living DNA is showing 92.3% from the British Isles. So could that be higher because they have so many people from the British Isles in their database? That could be the case. Now remember I said around 6% from Ireland. In Ancestry, it was showing 2% and 3%. In My Living DNA, it shows 11.6%. And Genome Link is showing 19%. And Family Tree DNA is showing 40%. So that's quite a dramatic difference. Now, of all of the DNA tests that I did, I would have to say that Family Tree DNA was the least accurate. That one showed 40% Irish, 60% Central European, and under 1% Basque. Basque is a pretty small region, and no other DNA tests showed any Basque, and certainly none showed anywhere near as high as 60% for Central Europe. So that one I would recommend not to do if you're really looking for something accurate for your ethnicity. They did have an interesting little bit there about the ancient DNA, but I'm going to go into that a little bit later. Now, GenomeLink has a lot of different tests on it, and so they focus in on different regions for each one. I have not found any DNA test that separates Irish, Scottish, English, and French into 4 separate categories. None. They all seem to connect 2 of those together, Irish and Scottish together, Scottish and English together, or English and Northern France together. And that's just showing how much people move around and how blurry those lines are and how blurry those boundaries are from one place to another. I would really be curious, though, if somebody did separate those 4, because, of course, I, like many others, have the vast majority of my DNA from those 4 countries. And so since I can't separate them categorically, it's pretty hard to make a really good comparison with my actual genealogy. So we saw how dramatically different it can be for the different numbers, especially that Irish one from Family Tree DNA. Now, the Scottish side, like I said, on my genealogy is 37.5%. Ancestry DNA went from 56%, over half, to 47%, and it stayed there. My Living DNA has it at 22.6%, but they also have different numbers for Irish and Scottish together, which is 19%, and then Scottish and English together, which is around 2%. So overall, it would show higher than 22%, so could be up to 40% showing on My Living DNA for Scottish. Now, 23andMe doesn't do a whole lot of separation between all of those. So like I said, it's showing 88.9% for all of the British Isles, which is fairly high. It's higher than the genealogy. And then MyHeritage shows 21% for both Irish and Scottish, and then 66.9, so almost 67% for English. So that's showing the highest amount of English on MyHeritage. So yes, confusing. GenomeLink shows 17% Scottish and English together. I mean, well, they showed 19% for Irish. So that's showing a dominance in Irish, which is a little confusing. But if I look at the rest of GenomeLink, it's showing all kinds of things that I don't find on any other test. It's also showing 13% German, which is quite high. And like I said, I was finding probably under 1 or 2% German from my genealogy. Then it's got 12% Spanish, which is quite high. The next highest for Spanish is 7.7 on My Living DNA. And then we've got 11% Slavic from GenomeLink, 3% Eastern European, 1% Roma. So again, that Roma did come up, 1% on one of the tests. And it's got 2% Jewish, which I didn't find anywhere else, and 1% Balkan. Now that GenomeLink test is just for Europe. So that is a European specific test that I did, and they have a whole bunch of others, which I haven't gone into just because it made me a little less trusting of the test in general, that it came up with so many unusual findings. But if you look at the history of Europe and Middle East and Asia, these continents, Europe and Asia are not really 2 different continents. It's just like a lie that we keep telling ourselves. It's just perpetuating these political divisions from the ancient past, which is really foolish. It really is just Eurasia. It's one big continent. And even Africa has been connected to Eurasia since ancient times. So the idea that we're these separate continents and we can be easily divided is in itself just like a really strange idea. Um, so it's a bit weird why those results came that way. But if you look at that as perhaps measuring like 1,000 years ago, perhaps 1,000, even 2,000 years ago, there may very well have been the Roma and Jewish and Balkan and all of those people who at ancient times did migrate to Britain. And that's well known. The Roman Empire came a long time ago to Britain, and with it, a whole bunch of other immigrants that would have been a part of that very vast empire. So, other than that, there is the Middle Eastern part. So, the Middle East comes up for 23andMe. It's showing 0.2% Caucasian, Mesopotamian, and Iranian. On MyHeritage, it shows 0.8%. So not too surprising if you look into the past. Now, My True Ancestry, I said I was going to come back to that. So My True Ancestry goes way back into the archaeology, and it compares your DNA to actual findings from archaeological sites. Now, if you're at all interested in archaeology or history or ancient civilizations, I highly recommend trying My True Ancestry. Of all the websites I found, I think it's the most interesting. And it doesn't really show that much for modern day populations, but on that website, there's actually a whole bunch of tests. So that's the one that showed a little bit of what they call Amerindian, which is the first time that I saw that. And it also showed a bit of all the way to South Asia. So My True Ancestry goes back well before pre-Columbian, so pre-Roman. So what we've got for me, 63% Celtic, 20% Viking, only 8% Saxon. Vandals, did you even know that that was a real group of people? Yes, Vandals, I've got 4%. Franks, only 2%. Longobards and Ostrogoths. I don't know anything about them. That's interesting, but that's what my DNA is showing from those ancient archaeological sites and who I'm connected to. So I've got ancestry from Britain going all the way back at least 9,000 years. So have you ever heard of the Cheddar Man, which was a archaeological site that they found in the area of Cheddar in England? I have DNA in common with him, with this ancient man. So that's just confirmation that my ancestry is definitely very British. And the Celtic part too, I've always had a strong connection to the Celtic culture, and I feel very closely connected to that, and much more so than to Christianity or the Roman Empire or any of that. And Viking, that wasn't too surprising either. There was a lot of Vikings that came to Britain and France. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the genealogy part of it. So the genealogy part, as opposed to the genetics part, is the genealogy is when you actually do the research to find documentation on your ancestors. So my search on Ancestry took months. I've kind of been on and off. I haven't had a subscription in a little while, but I started that around 2014, I think is when it was, and made a lot of discoveries right away, especially about that one great grandmother that we couldn't figure out where she was from. So I ended up following that line from United Empire Loyalists in Ontario all the way to the very earliest settlers in New York City. And that's where the Dutch and German also come into play there. So that was very interesting. I never would have thought that I had any connection to New York City. And here, the very first Europeans that settled there were probably my ancestors. And of course, that whole area was being settled around the same time as New France. So the New Netherlands and New France in New England, or all sort of the beginnings of Europeans coming over and settling in that area in eastern North America. But I think the biggest surprise for me, which seems very small, but it was a big surprise for me, because I was raised in the prairies and my ancestors were all a part of this westward expansion of Canada into the western provinces. So I was used to all my relatives living on farms and living in small towns. Most of my grandparents were all born in small towns in Saskatchewan. So that kind of lifestyle is what I related my family to. And so what I thought was that the farmers in Europe came over to North America and started farming in Canada and the US. That's what I thought. So I thought I come from this lineage of farmers because I knew my grandpa was farming, and I found out I was completely wrong about that. So my most recent ancestors that came over, which was my grandpa and his parents, they were servants in London, England. And I just found out from my aunt that they were servants to the Queen. I had no idea. So they were the furthest thing from farmers you could think of. They were completely city people. So that's what blew me away is as I'm looking into my English ancestry, I'm seeing generations of people in London and, working job like bricklayer. That one blew me away because I've always been obsessed with brick buildings. I love brick buildings and they're not that common here. They were more common in about 100 years ago during that early settlement phase. And nowadays, building with brick is very rare in Western Canada. It's not really a thing. And even when they broke down those different regions in Great Britain, most of the regions that my ancestors came from is from cities and not from rural areas at all. Yeah, I think just a little bit about my one ancestor, Marie-Hélène. And her identity has been questioned a lot. I've had relatives reach out to me. I've had, conversation with other relatives that I know about her. And the story that I heard is that her parents were from France and went back to France for some reason and left her with another family. And I don't know why, and I don't understand what happened. They did have a lot of children in that family. And so some of the people in that lineage have reached out on Ancestry going, do you have any more information about them? Because we're not able to find any documentation of them in France. And I think that there was a relative from France that came over that visited with my grandmother and maybe had a little explanation. So I'm hoping to find more information on that. Because it could explain why in my genealogy the French is so low. So of all these different ethnicities, and I mentioned in my genealogical search, I found 25% France. So pretty much my grandmother was completely ethnically French, as far as I know. My grandmother learned nothing but French when she was very young, and then she slowly became anglicized throughout her life so that when I knew her, she didn't speak any French at all anymore. Now, the French side on my genetics, on Ancestry, it was showing 3% in the old version, and then it went up to 10%, and then down to 5%. And when you look at 23andMe, it's showing 7% for both France and Germany together. And in Genome Link, it's showing 1% for French. So the highest was the last version of Ancestry DNA. And the other ones do show, so Ancestry DNA does have England and Northern France together. So the old version showed 35%, then 28%, then 31%. But remember, that's with English included. And so as far as I knew that English was around 36%. So if you were to put those together, it would be over 50%, and it's not showing anything close to that. Now, on my living DNA, I don't see any French. And again, 23andMe is very low. And my heritage, doesn't show any French at all. So that's a big mystery, and I don't understand it. And now that I've took a look at my other relatives that I know on that side of the family, a lot of them are showing around 5 to 8% French as well. So why is that French level so low? I'm not sure. What I found out is that in France, it's actually illegal to do these DNA tests. That's very sketchy. I'm very weirded out by why France is doing that. I hope that they change their rules. For a country that's so significant to the history of science, why are they so resistant to scientific research? But when I saw that I do have other relatives from the Quebec side, and the Quebec side does seem to show a higher level of French, you start to realize that all people are connected and all of those geographical lines are blurry. So I don't see it as anything to be afraid of. I think knowledge is so important. And if we can contribute to knowledge and we can accelerate the research, then it just makes us more aware of who we are. And you don't have to be super proud. You don't have to stand behind your ancestors that did terrible things. You can still acknowledge that they did terrible things. And if they did great things, then that raises the bar for you as well, to look at your own ethics and your own life and see if maybe you could do better. So whether they were bad people or good people doesn't matter. We all have both of that in our ancestry. So I hope that there is more progress with this and that they change the rules and allow everyone to find out who they are. And maybe one day I will find out just how French I am and what that means and what my ancestry is on that side. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I probably will come back to genes and DNA quite a bit in the future. I hope you keep following, and I'll be bringing up discussions about this again in the future. Thank you.